Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm George Thomas. Today, we take a look at the Pentagon's budget request for 2023 that is showing signs of a possible shrinkage in the funding for our military. Plus, the latest in the investigation with an Al-JAZEERA journalist killed earlier this week during an Israeli counter-terrorism raid.
Our goal is to provide children an education where they have a biblical worldview so that then they can go out into the real world and be salt and light.
And we'll share more on what this pastor is looking to do to offer an alternative for parents looking to remove their children from public schools due to their policies. Then later, see a story of redemption from author, actor, and pastor Cal Mitchell.
I remember I got to one point in my life where I was just kind of like, I want to turn off the button, the off button. In those down times, God was always there.
All these stories and much more are coming up next from the CBN Newsroom.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
America's top leaders agree the world is quickly becoming more dangerous and unstable. And the latest report we're getting is that the Pentagon's budget request for 2023 is the largest in U.S. history. Still, get this, it could mean an overall drop in the defense spending once it's adjusted for inflation. That means the shrinking military in the face of a very growing and very unstable international world. My colleague, Caitlin Burke, has the top story.
America's top military leaders agree. The world is quickly becoming more dangerous and unstable. Defense analysts worry that new reality is not reflected in the proposed 2023 defense budget.
If the budget isn't keeping pace with inflation, if it's not keeping pace with the demand for real world assets and real world potential combat scenarios, then we're always going to be behind.
President Biden's overall budget proposal includes $813 billion in national defense spending, up $31 billion from the previous year. It was put together, though, before Russia invaded Ukraine, and with an assumption that inflation would drop to about 2.5%. That's considered unlikely, with numbers currently sitting at just over 8%.
So I think that our military establishment has just really lost its way, and there isn't an appreciation for what real war against a peer competitor, where we're operating thousands of miles from home at a disadvantage to whoever the enemy is that's operating at home. And we're seeing these unfortunate realities play out in these budgets and lack of capacity and shrinking of the force. We base our decisions on the size of the stockpile on our requirements. And, as we look around at our global requirements to support our plans, we believe that the stockpiles are adequate.
The Pentagon's mission for the new budget request includes operating under a divest to invest strategy. That means cutting certain programs now to invest in modernization that will hopefully pay off later. The Navy, for example, wants to retire 24 ships, a move that would shrink its fleet to just 280 ships over the next 5 years.
We won't increase the size of the fleet any more than one ship per year for the next 30 years. They won't get to their objective fleet of 355 ships until the year 2050.
Representative Elaine Luria fears that strategy compromises the ability to respond to the threats of today, specifically China. In 2021, Admiral Philip Davidson, the outgoing Indo-Pacific commander, predicted China would be in a strong position to attack Taiwan when the U.S. fleet is now set to be at its weakest.
He testified to the Senate that it's very likely that China could try to take Taiwan by force in the next 6 years, now 5 years. And so the idea that we're going to take a risk and really shrink the size of the Navy during this most vulnerable window is just not acceptable to me.
Last year, Congress was able to step in and boost defense spending. Luria hopes that can happen again.
If you think about, during the Cold War, during the Reagan administration, the defense budget was 5 to 6% of GDP. Right now, we're at about 3.6%. So, based on the threats that we have in the world, really think we need to start, pushing that up. I'd like to see us get to 5% of GDP, which would be, on the order of about $1 trillion.
The Navy isn't the only branch experts worry is headed in the wrong direction. The Air Force is asking Congress to retire 150 aircraft, with plans to add only 82 new planes. And the Army seeks to cut 12,000 soldiers from its ranks. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Thank you, Caitlin. Now to some other news. A nationwide shortage of baby formula continues to increase, and the Biden administration is working urgently to ensure that the formula can soon be readily available for families. The FDA is looking for ways to import baby formula from other countries to help ease the crisis. This includes possibly loosening import restrictions and allowing potential imports from Ireland, the Netherlands, and Chile. The shortage came after a voluntary recall back in Feb when Abbott Laboratories shut down its plant in Michigan after a voluntary recall of the formula amid reports of 2 infant deaths and other infants getting sick. The affected plant should come back online soon, though, but it could take weeks for supplies to be restocked. Now to the latest in the war in Ukraine. Moscow is threatening retaliation after Finland announced it wants to join the Western military alliance. Meanwhile, the latest fighting shows hard-pressed Ukrainian forces holding off the Kremlin forces. CBN's Brody Carter reports.
Gunfire breaks the silence at the Azovstal steel plant. Soldiers have been fending off Russian forces in the latest phase on the long standoff here. All civilians have escaped from the besieged steel plant in Mariupol. Now 2,000 Ukrainian fighters remain, one of many battles pointing to what could be a prolonged war, well through the rest of this year and beyond. Underground in Kharkiv, school children sheltering in a subway station strive for normalcy after schools and universities closed at the start of war. Now, 2.5 months in, Putin's war's backfiring after Finland announced it wants to join NATO. After being neutral for decades, the very thing Putin did not want. Finland's president delivering a blunt message for Putin.
Well, if that would be the case that we join, well, my response would be that you caused this. Look at the mirror.
The invasion was intended to keep NATO from adding more countries along Russia's border. Neighboring Sweden also expected to make a similar decision with an announcement set for Sunday. Moscow's response, that it would be forced to take what it called, quote, military technical steps in retaliation.
There are 1.9 million forces in NATO. Russia doesn't want to take on the NATO alliance.
Russia is having a difficult time taking on Ukrainian forces, which have made some gains on the battlefield, recapturing several towns and villages closer to the Russian border. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Thank you, Brody. There are new developments with Elon Musk and his deal to buy Twitter. Elon said in a tweet, quote, that the deal is temporarily on hold pending details supporting calculation that spam fake accounts do indeed represent less than 5% of users. That news, as you can imagine, sent Twitter shares down in pre-market trading. Coming up, we'll have the latest in the investigation of an Al-JAZEERA journalist killed during an Israeli counter-terrorism raid. Plus, a look at other news from the Middle East. Folks, please stay with us. Folks, welcome back. You're watching the CBN News NewsWatch program. There are several stories making headlines in the Middle East. First, 2 Palestinians were arrested after being suspected of carrying out a terror attack that killed 3 people in the central city of ELAD. Plus, an Al-JAZEERA journalist was shot and killed Wednesday after covering an Israeli counter-terror raid in the West Bank. For more stories on these, we are now joined by our Middle East Bureau Chief, my man, Chris Mitchell. Chris, great to see you, my friend. Tragically, an Al-JAZEERA journalist was killed during this counter-terrorism raid, as I mentioned. Chris, what's the latest in the investigation of what on earth happened?
Well, George, first of all, the latest right now is that right now the burial of Shireen Abu Akleh is being buried right now behind us on Mount Zion. All sides right now agree it's a tragedy. Israel is asking for the PA for a joint investigation with the Palestinian Authority. They're refusing to cooperate with Israel. They won't release the bullet that killed Shireen. And right now they're blaming Israel for the murder. They're calling it a murder, heinous crime, and assassination. In fact, they're planning to take Israel to the International Criminal Court for what they say is a deliberate murder. She had an elaborate ceremony by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah today, being called a martyr. What's missing right now, George, in some of the reporting is the context and the background of what's happening right now. There were 19 Israelis killed in the last several weeks. There were terror attacks in ELAD, as you mentioned, in Tel Aviv and other places in Beersheba. And what this counterterrorism raid was meant to do was to get a Hamas terrorist. And that's why the firefight went on in Jenin, and that's where, tragically, Shireen was killed.
Chris, you're talking about this wave of terror attacks in the last several weeks. Any signs that this wave of terror may be subsiding?
Unfortunately, no, and I think the death of Shireen is going to actually fuel more terror attacks, regardless of who's at fault or what findings the investigation may happen. We talked earlier to an expert. He told CBN News that some of the funding of the latest wave, especially in this terrorist hotbed of Jenin, is actually coming from Iran. Also, the PA is using Shireen's death to put more spotlight on them, since the Abraham Accords in the region have made them, in the eyes of many, irrelevant. So they're using Shireen's death to really put the spotlight back on them. I actually, tragically, George, don't feel like it's really going to subside. It actually could increase right now. We see signs of that, here in the old city of Jerusalem, in places like Jenin and other Palestinian areas where the incitement is going on, asking for Palestinians to go ahead and kill Israelis wherever they might be. So really a good time to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem.
Absolutely. Chris, switching gears here, the Iranian nuclear deal, as you know, has been on hold for weeks. Could an agreement be signed soon? And what could the ramifications be if it is signed?
Yeah, we don't know exactly if it's going to be signed. We do know that negotiations are being held up, and the reason for that is Iran wants the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, taken off what's called the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. That's called the FTO. And the Biden administration right now hasn't decided one way or another whether or not they're going to do that. We know once the agreement is signed, from what we know about the agreement, many Middle East experts believe it's going to lead to a nuclear Iran. Perhaps in just a few years, and not only just one or two nuclear weapons, but actually an arsenal. Now, what they're telling us is that in turn, if Iran goes nuclear, then it's going to lead to nuclear proliferation in the region. The Saudis, the others, they may want a nuclear weapon as a deterrent for Iran's potential nuclear arsenal. And also, it represents an existential threat not only to these Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia, but to Israel as well.
Okay, Chris, just the last few seconds, tell us what we can expect on the next edition of Jerusalem Dateline.
Well, we're going to have more on the Iranian nuclear deal. We'll have an interview with former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, about his new book. It's called In the Lion's Den, Israel and the World. And it's fascinating insight into his 5 years, literally in the lion's den there in the United Nations. And we also interviewed George, the director of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. That's become a worldwide movement, urging people to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And just like now, these days, when all these terror attacks are happening, it really is a time to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem.
All right, terrific. Chris, thank you so much. By the way, folks, you can see more news from the Middle East with Chris and his awesome team on the CBN News channel tonight at 8:30 Eastern or on the CBN News app. Still ahead, as more parents look for alternatives to public schools, meet a local pastor with a multi-million-dollar plan to provide students with an education that's Christian-based. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Families are fleeing public schools all across this country. Loudoun County has been ground zero for parents' outrage over school policies. Now, a local pastor in the Northern Virginia community is spearheading a multi-million-dollar project to offer Christian-based education. Tara Mergener brings us the details.
Nestled in the rolling hills of Northern Virginia sits a sprawling tree-lined campus. Classrooms inside this shuttered private school empty. Once busy halls are eerily silent, each room like a time capsule of better days. But not for long.
After much prayer and discussion with our elders and pastoral leadership,
We will be launching Cornerstone Christian Academy.
With a campus about 20 miles from Cornerstone Chapel, the church will open the school in fall of 23.
But just kind of abandoned.
Yeah, I know.
Initially, there will be enough space for 500 elementary and middle school students.
Yeah, they have classrooms, desks, there's the gymnasium, there's a cafeteria down the hall. We're going to repurpose it for the Lord.
There are also plans to expand to high school and online learning.
Our goal is to provide children an education where they have a biblical worldview so that then they can go out into the real world and be salt and light.
The multi-million-dollar project is Pastor Gary Hamrick's response to what's playing out in public school systems across the country.
We find you, and we know we'll never be able to.
In our schools, kids are reading this, and you're going to tell me I can't read it to you?
The woman in the yellow trying to break up the fight.
3 students killed, 8 others shot.
I pledge allegiance to the queers.
Any religious tradition ascribes as God's will is no concern of this Congress.
You shut down a club for first graders studying the Bible. Do you feel good about that?
Yes, we do.
Loudon is considered the face of the nation's culture war. For more than a year, parents railing against everything from sexual assault on campus.
Organizers say the walkout was to show solidarity to victims of sexual violence.
To critical race theory, X-rated books in school libraries.
They're perverted because there is no other rational or reasonable explanation.
And transgender policies.
It's abuse to a child, and it's sinning against our God.
Tanner Cross's dismissal for refusing to call students by preferred pronouns became the last straw for Hamrick.
Our kids need an alternative. We have to ourselves, as a church, get engaged. What can we do to help give a Christian-based, Christian biblical worldview education for our children?
Abby Platt, who saw 3 children suspended for not wearing masks at school, even though the state mandate was lifted, applied immediately.
LCPS has lost our trust, and we really want our children to be in an environment that is safe, where they will focus on literacy and learning instead of indoctrination.
Loudoun County schools have been the subject of so much controversy. Pastor Gary knew there'd be interest locally. What he didn't expect was to hear from parents in 27 states eager to enroll their children.
Cornerstone has been inundated with inquiries, and not just from parents. Teachers want out of public schools, too.
By the end of the week, we had over 2,500 students pre-registered. I got over 450 emails from teachers wanting employment.
The overwhelming response mirrors what appears to be a national trend. Nearly 2 million students left public schools between 2020 and 2021. With large numbers now enrolled in Christian education. Before the pandemic, many Christian schools struggled with low enrollment. Now there are waiting lists.
One of the things that came out of COVID was parents were looking over the shoulder of their kids as they were taking online classes and realizing some of the stuff that's being taught is against their own values, even if they weren't Christians.
E. Ray Moore, founder of the Conservative Christian Education Initiative, calls it a once-in-a-100-year moment.
It awakened in people, many Christians in churches and some pastors, the desire and the recognition that it's our responsibility to provide the Christian education of our children, not the government.
The Association of Christian Schools International, one of the country's largest networks, has seen double-digit growth since the pandemic hit. The Association of Classical Christian Schools has added some 10,000 students. The number of homeschoolers has doubled, and new Christian schools are popping up all over the country.
We're seeing a resurgence in homeschool co-ops and hybrid homeschools and learning pods, and both churches and communities and even cul-de-sacs of people that are becoming very creative in what is good quality Christian value-based education.
With many public schools mired in controversy, interest in Christian education is expected to keep rising.
Do you think that this is part of a revival or part of an awakening of people because things have gotten so contentious?
Yeah, it's definitely part of a revival that I hope sweeps across this nation in different ways, not just in terms of schools and education, but what is happening in our churches. The sleeping giant has been awakened, and parents begin to realize when their kids' future is at stake, we need to get involved.
Like many church leaders, Hamrick believes Christian schooling is no longer a nicety, but a necessity. In Middleburg, Virginia, Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Thank you, Tara. Coming up, author, actor, and pastor Kel Mitchell shares a story of redemption and overcoming sorrow. We'll have that coming up. Author, actor, and pastor Kel Mitchell is known as the star of shows like All That and Kenan and Kel. What you may not have known is that he suffered from depression and was frustrated with life, even though he was landing roles in Hollywood. His personal struggles even brought him to the brink of suicide. But Kel ended up hitting a turning point in his life, overcoming sorrow and entering into ministry. He shares some of his story with Billy Hallowell of CBN's Faith Wire.
I went through a lot of ups and downs within my life and within my career. And in those down times, God was always there. He was there in the up and in the downs. And when I decided not to take my life at that point, and I decided to live, that's when things changed around for me.
That's so awesome. You can watch the full interview of Kel's story of redemption by going to CBNNewsWatch.com. I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all of you who prayed for me over these last 3 months as I have been covering the war in Ukraine. I have felt those prayers, and I really appreciate that. So I appreciate that, folks. Folks, you can remember, you can find out more about our news programs on the CBN News channel anytime or online with us at CBNNews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com. Or you can talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We hope you'll join us again next time. From all of us here from the headquarters of the Christian Broadcasting Network, I'm George Thomas. Have a great day and a great rest of the weekend. Ciao.